Ilona's talk will segue beautifully to our finale for this evening, which I'm so much looking forward to, and that is Edward Sullivan's conversation with Roberta and Richard Huber, who are such great collectors of Spanish and Portuguese colonial art. It's such a part of the mission of the center to hear from the horse's mouth, if you will, whether via oral histories, as Ian commented, or from collectors like the Hubers, and so I'm honored that they agreed to do this. Roberta and Richard have been collectors of Spanish and Portuguese colonial art for over 40 years and have assembled one of the largest and broadest collections in private hands in the United States. Their collection was exhibited at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in early 2013. I hope most of you in the audience saw that stunning exhibition called Journeys to New Worlds, Spanish and Portuguese Colonial Art from the Roberta and Richard Huber collection. The Hubers lived in South America for over 15 years, beginning in 1962 in Buenos Aires, and they've traveled extensively throughout the region for 50 years. They have sons living in Chile and Brazil and continue enlarging and enhancing their collection right up to the present day, and they're working on another series of exhibitions of their collection for several U.S. museums. Roberta has been involved in a number of cultural institutions as a board member, trustee, or volunteer, including the Brooklyn Museum, New York Historical Society, and Hispanic Society, the Voices of Ascension, and the Institute of Fine Arts Graduate Center. Richard, on the other hand, spent most of his career in international banking with Citibank, Chase, Continental Bank, and the First National Bank of Boston. He then joined the insurance industry and ended his professional career as chairman, president, and CEO of Aetna. He has been involved in a number of investments in Latin America in fields as far-flung as river transportation, vineyard management, and wine production, rail car leasing, animal feed, a cruise ship serving Antarctica, a supermarket chain, ranching and farming, and real estate, among others. It's amazing he had time to collect art. They both speak fluent Spanish and Portuguese, have enjoyed many delightful and informative conversations. I have enjoyed many wonderful conversations with the Hubers myself, and I was truly over the moon when they agreed to sit for this conversation with Edward to round out the first day of our symposium. So please give Roberta and Dick Huber a warm welcome.
So Inga's very nice introduction really gave a great framework for the background of the collection. I also wanted to say that to a certain extent, this is a very nice pretext to have conversations with friends, not only friends in the audience, but friends on the stage. And I've known Dick and Roberta for many years and have always enjoyed our conversations in their house in various venues. And we'll talk in a few minutes about a very decisive trip that both Roberta and I made to the Philippines. But what I thought would be interesting would be to just begin with some visuals, as we always want to look at things. And so we have a few objects, and perhaps it would be just a good idea to begin looking at them, and since it's hard for me to see what they are, we have a cheat sheet here, and if you would just start by saying what they are, and then we'll start our questions. Do you want to do that, Roberta?
Yes.
Or Dick?
Yeah. I'll begin because this is one of the paintings that, for me, because my part of our collecting includes so much of my determination that things have to be aesthetically pleasing. Now, there are many ways to interpret that, I realize. But this, when we first saw this painting on the far right, which is of Archangel, typically from the Altiplano or from Cusco, has a great deal of gold and bright colors and wonderful lace depiction. When we got him, he was needed to be cleaned, but the faces and the hands to Dick and me are extremely important, and they had not been affected. The reason that we were interested in it was, as I say, because I think because all of our pieces we find that we really love transcend any sort of religion. It goes beyond that, just to a moral intensity and a way that art takes you into another world and gets you out of your own box. And that is one of the reasons that we were so keen on getting this painting.
Well, I think also this demonstrates that it's one subject, St. Michael, but one subject depicted in different media in quite different periods of time. And so something which we might get into a little later with Edward is the collecting process. We have gone considerably further upriver than most people in the collecting process. And that's due to where we began, which was living in South America. And so we were able to go frequently to Bolivia, to Peru, to countries where these pieces originate. This was before rules that are in place today and which we admire and respect, but when the process of taking things out or cross borders was much less defined, let's put it that way. So the painting Roberta referred to is obviously Cusco Altiplano. The top statue is Brazilian. It's Minas, again, sort of mid-18th century, in the style of Alexandrino. I wish it were an Alexandrino. The ivory piece over on the upper right corner is an extraordinary piece. That's a full meter. The body itself is a full meter high. And that was exhibited at Maastricht and didn't sell, thank goodness. We were able to track it down to the dealer who was in London, and were able to acquire it there. It's Filipino, but probably late 18th century, if not early 19th century. Extraordinary condition. The other ivory San Miguel is Hispano-Filipino, and that we acquired more recently in an auction house in Lisbon. Again, what was it doing there? Who knows? But the final piece, which is much smaller than it looks, which is a plaque of St. Michael, what we found through a reference from a friend at an auction house in that center of Hispanic colonial art, Stockholm. So you never know, and that indeed has been part of the fun of it.
So, to continue our IDs, sort of like an exam, these two chests. Can you talk to us a little bit about those?
Yeah, are they, oh, yes. Yes, one, this is something that because of our interest in what we have seen in Manila, and Edward will refer to the symposium I went to, with some other people who are now here in the room as well in 2005. But the one on the left is an embellished piece with a defining type of lacquer from Colombia, which originates in Colombia. So therefore, it's on. Yeah, oh, sorry. Barniz, which is something that we had recently begun to see at a similar piece in the Hispanic Society, which is a lacquer that has nothing to do with Japanese or Chinese lacquer as far as its origin. It's a tree that has a particular greenish color, and it's taken and heated and then chewed and then stretched again, and finally applied in onion skin thin layers to the wooden base, and then embellished with these wonderful, which are difficult to see. This is lovely to have it magnified because it has mermaids and Portuguese hunters with their typical 16th century hats, and it's got all sorts of wonderful mythical animals. So that has been an interest, because the farther east you go or the farther west you go on the trade routes, which is a key to learning about all this material, you learn more. And you see different trade goods, which very often are much coveted because the trade to Latin America was because they had, in many cases, in certain centers like Potosi, a great deal of money and a lust for luxury goods.
So these are all the images that we have, but I think we'll keep these on the screen. And those of us who had the opportunity and the pleasure, the privilege of seeing a beautiful exhibition that Inga referred to earlier last year at the Philadelphia Museum, had an experience of trying to figure out definitions of a collection of colonial art. Of course, there are many of them. Some collections of colonial art of the Americas center upon strictly the Spanish-speaking countries, and very often on Mexico and Peru. Others have slightly wider definitions, but I don't really know of any collection that has quite the breadth of the Huber's collection and the interest that they are demonstrating in not only colonial art from the colonies of the Americas, but from the Spanish colonies of Asia as well. And I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about this global, to use an overused word, but this truly is a collection in which the ideas of crossing borders, of cross-pollination of influence, as it were, are really paid much more attention to than they are in other collections, be they private or institutional. And I think that would probably be a very good point for you to illuminate us on.
Well, thank you, Edward, because it has been one of our prime fascinations. And any idea that globalization is something fairly new is obviously nonsense. And these art forms show how global the interchange of artistic concepts and subject matter was going way back to the 16th century. Perhaps the ivories are the best example because the ivories for the Spanish Empire were largely manufactured in the Philippines, mainly by ethnic Chinese workmen, craftsmen, but living in a neighborhood of the Philippines. What would happen if you were a fairly comfortable family, let's say living in Madrid, and you decided you wanted a little figure of the Virgin for your home altar? You would either pull a sheet out of one of the books of engravings from the Flanders of various religious objects, or you'd get a local artist to sketch something out, give it to a courier who'd take it to Seville, and get on the next boat to Havana, from Havana to Veracruz, cross Mexico by mule, get over the Acapulco, catch that year's Acapulco galleon. They went for 250 years, every year, didn't miss a year. Went to Manila, probably put up for auction, and somebody bid to produce that piece. It was produced. 6 months or whatever later, it would catch the next Manila galleon back to Acapulco, hop on a mule, cross to Veracruz, blah, blah, blah. And equivalent, let's say about 4.5 years later, the 17th century equivalent of the FedEx man would sort of knock on your door and say, "Madam, here's your Virgin, just sign here." In the case of the Portuguese colony, it was very similar, but Araves, the other way around. The Portuguese, the madam in Oporto would get her little image, go down to Lisbon, from Lisbon to Rio, round the Cape of Good Hope, to Goa, be put out to work, brought back around the Horn again, around the Cape of Good Hope, and back to Lisbon. These two patterns of trade persisted for several hundred years. And whereas there was theoretically little interchange between the two, that's not true. Leave it to the crafty Jesuits. The Jesuits paid very little attention to who was in the crown. That ultimately got them into some trouble. But they were frequently interchanging ideas, concepts, images between the two centers of production, which were for two separate empires. We find that very fascinating.
And also, I'm very interested in your inclusion in a very serious way of Brazil, because in many of the colonial collections, we don't see Brazil, and Brazilian art is particularly absent, especially in collecting habits of those people interested in colonial art in the United States. So I'd venture to say that you have one of the few collections that in which Brazil has a pride of place. And you've lived in Brazil, you became interested in Brazilian art fairly early on.
Yeah, we became interested in Brazil, but it was mainly the sculpture and the fact that some of it was later than what we'd seen, produced later in the 18th century than some of which we'd seen on the Altiplano. And of course, I would love to have more sculpture. But the silver, we do have some pieces that are from Brazil, not that many, but we do have some. And the museums in Brazil, once again, it's visiting the museums that you, museums and churches, of course, that you first get inspired to find out more, and then you want to find out who were the craftsmen, who were the people. For example, many of the ivories in Goa were crafted by Hindu workmen who were under the tutelage of the Jesuits. So you never know when they begin to take over themselves in the fact that they're creating wonderful pieces, and when the original Jesuits die or are sent to Japan from Goa, as they often went back and forth these huge distances. So that's always been a factor. But Brazil is, because we saw some of the colonial cities, and we also saw many churches where things were not being cared for at all. And you always see this material and you think, well, perhaps we could, if they are available for sale, and which at many points they were, we could do better. And then we are very happy to share our collection with anybody who's interested.
Yeah, I think, as Roberta implied, there's a lot less available for Brazil. It has an incredibly rich colonial heritage, particularly the whole Northeast. The city of Salvador is a wonderful place. But paintings, there were relatively few, and the climate didn't really help preserve them. So you don't have availability of much in the way of paintings. Sculpture, yes, but even there, mostly wood. We just acquired a piece in an small auction house in Madrid, and it's not in great shape. We're going to have to do some significant conservation work on it, but it's a beautiful piece. So it's harder to collect, I think, in Brazil, but.
Well, you mentioned climate, and of course that's always a factor. It's a factor, for example, in the Caribbean. And so there was a very, very important history of Caribbean colonial painting. I think much of it is lost because of the climate. But perhaps to wrap up, I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier, Roberta, about our trip to the Philippines. There was a reopening of a very distinguished museum in Manila called the Ayala Museum, and to celebrate their reopening, they had a major symposium that covered, among other topics, this history of colonial art from the Philippines. And perhaps you want to talk a little bit about that, because you've said to me on various occasions that it was a really eye-opening experience when we were both together at that conference and participated in it.
No, it was because this was a collection of ivories, totally did not include any ivories from other countries, and they had been collected not only by the museum, but various other major collectors in the Philippines. You're lucky if you can find anything that they don't get to first. They're very avid and so knowledgeable about what their heritage in ivories. And it was a groundbreaking because it was very scholarly. There were some people from the Met as well who took some pieces that the Met has in its collections, and there were two major scholars worldwide. One is from Madrid, a Spanish lady, and the other is a Philippine, and it was wonderful. They're friends, but scholastic arguments are wonderful when you can be part of them, and they were fighting about the fact that who were the artisans. And of course, the Spanish scholar said, well, of course, they were the Chinese who were living in their Chinese areas in the Philippines. And the, of course, Philippine scholar stood up for her land and her people and said, no, of course, some of these were done by the Philippine artisans. But I have a feeling, because of the tradition of Chinese ivory carving in China, they were, the madrileña was correct in her assumptions in scholarly work. But I just want to point out, museums have been key, and symposia have been key in my understanding of all of these museum exhibitions and scholars. It's just totally key to learning and then coming to the States and meeting other people who are in the same field.
So, I'm very grateful for your expose of your collection, and I think that we probably will continue to expand, and hopefully we will see more exhibitions such as the splendid show in Philadelphia, and the Huber collection will point the way to even further globalization of the colonial field. So thank you so much for your graciousness.
I don't know if any of you have questions of the Hubers or our speakers of earlier today, but we don't have a lot of time because we've run late. But if you are burning to ask something of them, that would be
Thank you very much. I truly am in awe of the familiarity of the artwork and your historical perspective. My question has to do with the difference between St. George and the dragon and St. Michael, and this, for example, the figure on the upper right.
Yeah.
My first question, before you spoke, was, is it St. George or is it St. Michael? I mean, how do you determine?
Well, St. George is usually on a horse.
Oh, I see.
And
No, there is often that confusion.
but they're very similar in the sense they both really were after dragons.
Demons.
Except
slay the beast.
as opposed to Santiago, who was traditionally Santiago Matamoros, Santiago killing Moors. That's a great symbol and a subject matter, in which when was transferred to the Americas, somewhat politically incorrectly, Santiago became Santiago Mata Indio. And that's, I think, those subject matters have become less popular in today's world.
But I think also the San Miguel, holding the scales is because he's measuring whether you go to heaven or hell, and he's either condemning or pulling you up into heaven, and so that is another way to.
And I think this is a good example also, if I may just interject. We have taken a lot more risk in our collecting with condition and even provenance. We've made some mistakes. But in the case of that particular ivory, the silver is modern. We've chosen, the figure did not come with those scales. So we've chosen to have those scales produced to depict the figure as it originally would have been, to make no attempt to disguise the fact that that's a modern addition, but we chose to do it because we find it aesthetically more pleasing. Some people criticize this.
Additional question?
When it comes to Latin American art, actually I am a Panamanian and I'm an art collector of modern art, especially Cuban and Latin American in general. when it comes to the price that you are willing to pay for these works, because these are colonial pieces, so there is not really a standard as you find in European art. So how do you manage that risk, or how do you manage that, like how much you are going to pay for, and how much you think is going to be worth?
Very good question. And there's, you know, it's the marketplace as always. But just, I might take that question to to tell a little anecdote. When with Joe Rischel and Mark Castro, we were preparing the final stages of the exhibition in Philadelphia. And needless to say, we had to put value on each piece for insurance purposes. And we worked fairly seriously at that, and we have a pretty good knowledge ourselves because we're in the market. And we also asked for some assistance from some of the people from Christie's who were in the field. And we came up with a number which I felt was a fairly accurate estimate of the value of each piece, which we then totaled up for the 140 odd pieces that were in the exhibition. And just coincidentally, at the almost the exact same day or the same week, Christie's was having an auction, and they sold a silk screen, a multiple of a Campbell soup can by Andy Warhol, which went for twice as much as the value of our whole collection. So when you talk about values in art, hey, it's not a science.
Actually, that is a perfect segue to tomorrow, because we'll talk more about the marketplace and make these connections between what we've been hearing about today and the more recent contemporary conundra and questions about that. So I'll use this moment to thank you all for your kind attendance, and certainly thank you so much to Dick and Roberta for your discussion.